Around the World in 80 Days by Jules Verne. Chapter 21, in which the master of the Tankadere runs great risk of losing a reward of £200. This voyage of 800 miles, undertaken in a craft of 20 tons, and especially in that season of year, it was venturesome. The Chinese seas were generally rough and exposed to terrible blows, principally during equinoxes, and this was one of the first days in November. It would have to take very evidently been to the advantage of the pilot to take his passengers so far as Yokohama, but he was paid so much per day, but would have been a great imprudence on his part to attempt such a voyage under such conditions, and it was a bold act, if not a rash one, to go as far as Shanghai. But John Bunsby had confidence in his Tangier, which rode the waves he a gull, and perhaps he was not wrong. During the latter hours of the day the Tangier sailed through the capricious channels of Hong Kong, in which her movements, from whatever quarter the wind came, she behaved handsomely. "I do not need, pilot," said Fogg, the moment the schooner touched the open sea, "to recommend you to all possible diligence." "Your honour may depend on me," replied John Bunsby. "In the matter of sails, we are carrying all that the wind would only interfere with the sailing of our craft. It is least your trade, not mine, pilot, and I trust you." Phileas Fogg, his body erect and his legs wide apart, standing straight as a sailor, looked at the surging sea without staggering. The young woman, seated aft, felt quite affected looking at the ocean, already darkened by the twilight which she was braving upon so frail a craft. Above her head were unfurled the white sails, looking into space like immense wings, and the schooner, impelled by the wind, seemed to fly through the air, and night set in. The moon was entering her first quarter, and her scanty light was soon extinguished in the haze of the horizon. And clouds were rising from the east, and were already covering a portion of the heavens. The pilot had put on his lights in position, an indispensable precaution to take it in these seas, so much frequented by the vessels bound landwards. Collisions were not rare, and by the time at the rate she was going, the schooner would be shattered by the least shock. Fix was dreaming forward on the vessel. He kept himself apart, knowing that Fogg naturally be not much of a talker. Besides, he hated to speak to this man, whose accommodations he had accepted, and thinking thus for the future, it appeared certain to him that Mr. Fogg would not stop at Yokohama, and he would immediately take the San Francisco steamer to reach America, and whose vast extent would assure him impunity and security. It seemed to him that Phileas Fogg's plan could not be simpler. Instead of embarking to New England in England for the United States, like a common rogue, Fogg made the grand rounds, and traversed three-quarters of the globe, in order to gain more surely the American continent, where he would quietly consume a large sum stolen from the bank, and after having thrown the police off his track. But once upon the soil of the United States, what would Fix do? Abandon this man? No, 100 times no, until he obtained an extraordinary order that he would not leave him for an instant. It was his duty, and he would fulfill it to the end. In any event, one happy result had been attained. Passepartout was no longer his master, and especially after the confidence Fix had reposed with him, it was important that the master and the servant would never see each other again. Phileas Fogg was constantly thinking of his servant, who had disappeared so singularly, and after having thought over everything, it seemed not impossible to him that, in consequence of misunderstanding, the fellow had set sail upon the Carnac at the last moment, and it was a good opinion of Mrs. Auda also, who regretted very much this good servant, to whom she owed so much, and it might have been they would find him again at Yokohama if the Carnac had taken him thither. It would be easy to find out. Towards 10 o'clock the breeze began to freshen, and perhaps it would have been prudent to take a reef, but the pilot, having carefully examined the state of the heavens, left riggingly as it was. Besides, the Tankadere carried sail admirably, and having deep draught of the water, everything was prepared to go rapidly in the case of a gale. At midnight, Phileas Fogg and Miss Auda descended into the cabins. Fix had preceded them and stretched onto one of the cots. As for the pilot and his men, they remained on deck all night. The next day, the 8th of November, at sunrise, the schooner had made more than 100 miles, and her course, frequently checked, showed that her average speed was between 8 and 9 knots. The Tankadere carried full sail, and in this rig she obtained the maximum speed. If the wind kept the same, the chances were in her favor. The Tankadere, during the whole day, did not go far from the coast, whose currents were favorable to her, in which 5 miles off, at most, was her starboard quarter. Irregularly outlined appeared sometimes across the clearings, and the wind coming from the land was, on that account, not quite so strong. A fortunate circumstance for the schooner, for the vessels of a small tonnage suffer above all from the roll of the sea, which interferes with their speed, killing them, to use the sailor's expression. And towards the noon, the breeze abated a little and set in from the southeast, and the pilot put up his pole, but at the end of 2 hours it was necessary to take them down, as the winds freshened up a little again. Mr. Fogg and the young woman, very fortunately unaffected by seasickness, ate with a good appetite the preserves and ship biscuits. Fix was invited to share the repast, and was compelled to accept, knowing very well that it is necessary to ballast stomachs as vessels, but it vexed him to travel in this manner expense to be fed from his provisions rather against his grain. He ate, daintily it is true, but he finally ate. However, this repast finished, he took Mr. Fogg aside and said to him, "Sir, this sir scorched his lips, and controlled himself not to call her this gentleman. Sir, you have been very kind to offer me a passage on your vessel. Although my resources do not permit me to expend this as freely as I do, I intend to pay my share." "Let us not speak of that, sir," replied Mr. Fogg. "But if I insist—" "No, sir," repeated Fogg, in a tone that did not admit the reply. "That will enter into the general expenses." Fix bowed, and having a stifling feeling, going forward, he lay down, not saying a word more during the day. In the meantime they were moving rapidly on. John Bunsby had high hopes. He said to Mr. Fogg several times that they would arrive at Shanghai at the desired time. Mr. Fogg simply replied that he counted on it, and the whole crew went to work in earnest. The reward enticed these good people, so there was not a sheet which was not consciously tightened, not a sail which was not vigorously hoisted, not a lurch for which the man at helm could be blamed. They wouldn't have manoeuvred so vigorously in a regatta of the Royal Yacht Club. In the evening, the pilot marked on the log the distance of 220 miles from Hong Kong, and Phileas Fogg might hope that arriving at Yokohama he would not have to note any delay in his journal. Thus, first serious mischance he had suffered since his departure of London would not probably affect his journey worth mentioning. During the night, in the early hours of the morning, the Tankadere entered without difficulty the Straits of Fokien, which separated the large island of Formosa with the Chinese coast, and she crossed a Tropic of Cancer. The sea was very rough in these straits, in full eddies formed by the counter-currents. The schooner became laboured heavily, and the short waves broke up her course. It became very difficult to stand upon the deck. With the day and the wind became fresher, there was appearance of squalls in the heavens. Besides, a barometer announced a speedy change of the atmosphere, and daily movements were irregular. The mercury oscillated capriciously, and the sea was rising towards the southeast in long swells, betokening a tempest. The evening before the sun had set in a red haze, amid the phosphorescent skeletons of the ocean. The pilot examined the threatening aspect of the sky for a long time, and muttered between his teeth indistinctly, and at a certain moment, finding himself near a passenger, said to himself in a low voice, "Can I speak freely to your honour?" "You can," replied Phileas Fogg. "Well, we're going to have a squall. Will it come from north or the south?" replied Mr. Fogg simply. "From the south. See, a typhoon is coming up. Good for the typhoon from the south, since it will send us in the right direction." "If you take it so," replied the pilot, "I have nothing more to say." John Bunsby's presentiments did not deceive him, and at least advanced a less advanced season of the year, the typhoon, according to the expression of the celebrated meteorologist, would have sped off like a luminous cascade of electric flames. When the winter equinox, it was feared that it would burst with violence. The pilot took his precautions in advance, and he had all his schooners sailed reefed, and the yards were brought on deck, the pole-masts were dispensed with, and all hands went forward, and the latches were carefully fastened. Not a drop of water could then enter the hull of the vessel. Not a single triangular sail, foresail of the strong canvas, was hoisted as a storm jib, as to hold the schooner to the wind behind, and they waited. John Bunsby begged his passengers to go down into the cabin, but in the narrow space, almost deprived of air, and knocked about by the waves, this imprisonment had nothing agreeable. Neither Mr. Fogg nor Mrs. Outer, nor even Fix was intended to leave the deck. Towards 8 o'clock the storm of the rain wind struck the deck, and there, with nothing but a little bit of sail, the Tankadere were raised like a feather by the wind, and the violence, which not could be well described in words, compared to her speed, quadruple than that of the locomotive rushing under full head of steam, and it would be still below the truth. During the whole day the vessel ran on thus forward north, and carried by tremendous waves, preserving fortunately the rapidity of their equals to theirs. 20 times she was almost submerged by these mountains of weather which arose her upon the rear. But the adroit turn of the helm by the pilot warded off from the catastrophe, and passengers were sometimes covered over by showers of spray which they received philosophically. Fix did not like it, doubtless, but the intrepid Auda, with her eyes fixed on her companion, whose coolness she could only admire, showed herself worthy of him, and braved the storm at his side. As for Phileas Fogg, it seemed that typhoon had formed a part of his programme. Up at this time the Tankadere had always held her course north, and but towards the evening, as it might have been feared, the wind was shifting 3 quarters, blew from the northwest. The schooner, now having struck to the side having now her side to the waves, was terribly shaken. The sea struck her with violence well calculated to terrify anyone who did not know solidly every part of the vessel is fastened together, and with nightfall the tempest grew wilder, seeing darkness come on. With it the increase of the storm, John Bunsby felt great uneasiness, and asked himself it would not be time to put in somewhere else, and he consulted his crew. His men consulted, and John Bunsby approached Fogg and said to him, "I believe, your honour, that we will do well to make one of the ports of the coast." "I believe so also," replied Phileas Fogg. "Ah," said the pilot, "but which one?" "I only know one," replied Phileas Fogg quietly, "and that is Shanghai." The pilot could not at first comprehend the first few moments which this answer meant, how much absurdity and intensity comprised. He cried, "Ah, well, yes, your honour is right. Went to Shanghai." And the direction of the Tankadere was waveringly kept to the north. It was truly a terrible sight. It was a miracle that the little craft did not capsize, and twice she was submerged, and everything would have been carried off the deck if the fastening of the ropes had given away. Mrs. Outer was worn out, but she did not utter a complaint. And more than once Phileas Fogg had to rush towards her to protect her from the violence of the waves. And daylight appeared. The tempest was still raging with the greatest fury. However, the wind fell again south-east. It was a favourable change, and the Tankadere resumed her way on this high sea, whose waves then struck, whose produced by the new direction of the wind. Thence a shock of counter-rolling waves would have crushed a less solidly built bark. From time to time, through the broken mist of the coast could be perceived not a ship in sight. The Tankadere was the only one keeping the sea, and at noon there were some signs of a calm which, sinking the sun towards the horizon, were more distinct. In the short duration of the tempest were owing its very violence, and the passengers, completely worn out, could eat a little and take some rest. The night was comparatively quiet, and the pilots had the sails hoisted again in a low reef. The speed of the vessel was considerable, and the next day, the 11th, at day-dawn, the coast being sighted, John Bunsby was able to assert that they were not 100 miles from Shanghai. 100 miles, and only this day left to make the distance. That very evening Mr. Fogg ought to arrive at Shanghai, and if he did not wish to miss the departure of the Yokohama steamer. Without the storm, he would have been lost several hours. He would not, at this moment, have been 30 miles from the port. The breeze sensibly slackened, but fortunately the sea fell with it. The schooner was covered with canvas. Poles, sails, counterjibs were all carried, and the sea foamed under her keel. At soon the Tankadere was not more than 45 miles from Shanghai, and she had 6 hours more to make that port before the departure of the steamer Yokohama. Fears of all were great, and they wanted to arrive at any cost, and felt their hearts impatiently beating. Phileas Fogg doubtless excepted. The little schooner must have been keeping an average of 9 knots, with the wind constantly going down. It was an irregular breeze, with capricious puffs coming down from the coast. They passed, and the sea became more smooth immediately after. But the vessel was so light, and her high sails, a fine material, caught the capricious breeze so well that, with the current in her favour, at 6 o'clock John Bunsby counted 10 miles from Shanghai's river, and for the city itself it situated a distance of 12 miles at least above the mouth. And at 7 o'clock they were still 3 miles from Shanghai. A formidable oath escaped the pilot's lips, and it was evident that the reward of 200 pounds was going to slip from him. He looked at Mr. Fogg, and Mr. Fogg was impassible, and his whole fortune was at stake at this moment. At this moment, too, a long black funnel, crowned with a wreath of smoke, appeared on a long edge of water. It was the American steamer going at the regular hours. "Maledictions on her!" cried John Bunsby, who pushed back the rudder desperately. "Signal her," said Phileas Fogg simply. The small brass cannon stood forward on the deck of the Tankadere, and it served to make signal in the hazy weather. And the cannon was loaded to the muzzle, but at that moment the pilot was going to apply red-hot coal to the touch-hole. Mr. Fogg said, "Hoist your flag." The flag was hoisted half-mast in a signal of distress, and he hoped that the American steamer, perceiving it, would change her course a moment to seize the little craft. "Fire!" said Mr. Fogg, and the booming of the little cannon sounded through the air.